The man known to history as Edward Plantagenet, who would become King Edward IV of England, was born on the 28th of April 1442 in Rouen, Normandy. He was the third of 12 children, 7 of whom survived to adulthood, and the eldest surviving son and heir. Of the third Duke and Duchess of York, Richard Plantagenet and Cecily Neville. At the time of his birth, Edward's father, Richard, Duke of York, held command of the French campaign in Normandy on behalf of King Henry VI. Edward lived in his parents' lavish establishment in Rouen until he was 3 years old, with his elder sister Anne, their younger brother Edmund, and their younger sister Elizabeth. Only 3 of the 7 children whom Duchess Cecily gave birth to between 1446 and 1455 survived their infancy. Margaret and Edward's most famous younger brothers, George and Richard. Less than a year after Elizabeth's birth in 1444, the family departed Rouen and returned to England, taking up residence at Fotheringhay Castle in Northamptonshire. Over the next few years, the family divided their time amongst their various estates, but likely lived most consistently at Fotheringhay and at Ludlow Castle. In Wales, next to the king himself, Richard Plantagenet was the greatest landowner in England, with estates in more than 20 counties, as well as estates in Ireland. His annual income is estimated to have been about £7,000, equivalent to approximately $4.3 million. Today, there are few specifics are known about Edward's childhood and early education, but much can be inferred based upon the historical documents from his reign, the instructions Edward gave for his own son's education, and based on what is generally known about the child-rearing and educational practices of the English aristocracy during the 15th century. Duchess Cecily may have taken aspects of her children's early education in hand personally, such as religious instruction and basic literacy. Cecily, however, was engaged in the near-constant business of childbearing until her eldest children, including Edward, were well into their adolescence. Additionally, she was the Duchess of York, the lady and the chatelaine of great estates, and might presumably have relied more heavily on nurses instead, had she not had the time to see to her children's daily needs and early education herself. This is quite likely, as Edward reportedly formed a strong bond with his childhood nurse in Normandy, and of Caux, and often spoke warmly of his young childhood under her care. During his later reign, he granted her an annual pension of £20. Edward and Edmund were sent to live at Ludlow Castle under the care of a governor or male guardian, and began lessons with a resident private tutor around the ages of 6 or 7. All of the York boys studied Latin and French, showing impressive proficiency in both languages. Later in life, they also most likely studied arithmetic, history, and literature, as well as music, dance, and social etiquette, which were important accomplishments for courtly life. They received extensive military training, including riding, swordplay, and jousting. These martial skills would have had to be mastered with the boys fully armored, adding another layer of required skill. Altogether, military strategy and maneuvers may well have been part of their history lessons or military training, as Edward later demonstrated consistent success and a talent for leadership on the battlefield. Edward likely also received training in property law and estate management, which might demonstrate that the Duke of York had not yet begun to envision either himself or his eldest son taking the throne. Until the late 1450s, estate management was the province of a nobleman rather than a king, and such training might explain Edward's notably active personal engagement with the law, justice, and the royal finances during his reign, which was not typical of medieval kings. As a young man, Edward was noted for his charm, charisma, and his sharp intelligence. But for all his fine education, Edward did not prove to be an academic or an intellectual. He enjoyed reading and commissioning printed and exquisitely illuminated books bound in silk and velvet for his personal library, a large portion of which has survived and been preserved. Edward's personal literary taste ran heavily toward chivalric romances and popular histories of great men, great deeds, and glorious battles, written mostly in French and English, which he read for his own pleasure. However, he owned few texts in Latin, the language of European intellectualism, and showed little interest in the emerging philosophical currents of humanism or in any other particularly scholarly pursuits. Edward naturally also owned several religious texts, but he does not seem to have been particularly devout in his religious sensibilities. His mother, Cecily Neville, was known to have been a devotedly pious woman with a strong scholarly interest in the writings of female Christian mystics such as Bridget of Sweden and Catherine of Siena. Edward, however, seems not to have heavily absorbed the intellectualism of the age or his mother's reportedly notable piety, and consistently demonstrated his disinterest in more worldly pursuits. He was described by his contemporaries as eminently able, cheerful, gallant, and generous, with a good and even temper. Edward was well liked for his friendly, engaging manner and his ability to be at ease in any company, not typical of young men raised to be kings, which, of course, Edward was not. He was also exceptionally daring and confident, even to the point of vanity, both regarding his abilities and the Plantagenet good looks he had inherited. Multiple observers and chroniclers remarked upon Edward's exceptional handsomeness. The most well-known portrait of Edward IV, which hangs in London's National Portrait Gallery, shows a rather tired, middle-aged man with more than a few extra pounds on his frame, with dark brown hair and light brown eyes. However, this portrait was painted circa 1540, nearly 60 years after Edward's death. Documentary sources from Edward's time do suggest that he gained a great deal of weight as he approached middle age, thanks to his prodigious indulgence in fine wine and food. When Edward's tomb at Windsor was opened in 1789, visitors reportedly left with locks of his hair. Several such swatches and strands of brown hair, purporting to have been Edward's, had been sold at auction in recent years. However, it is now known that some of Edward's siblings were fair-haired and blue-eyed, and he himself reportedly had several fair-haired or red-haired children. It is therefore possible that Edward was born with blonde or reddish-blonde hair, which darkened as he aged, and he may have had lighter-colored eyes than his portraits depict. We do know for sure that Edward stood at least 6 feet 3 inches, or 191 centimeters tall, which was quite exceptional for medieval Europe, where the average adult male was usually no taller than roughly 5.5 feet, little more than 160 centimeters. Sir Thomas More later described Edward as strong and clean-made, or well-proportioned, with broad shoulders in his youth. Tall, handsome, charming, and vigorous, Edward must have cut quite an impressive figure on horseback. Predictably, not the least notable of Edward's qualities was his love for the company of women, which his conduct throughout his romantic life, even as a married man, makes plain. Left to his own devices, Edward almost certainly would have lived a predictable life as the 4th Duke of York, willingly serving the king, inheriting the bulk of his father's estates, marrying, having children, and likely supporting a score of mistresses and their illegitimate children until his death. As it was, he was the firstborn son of a family with a legitimate claim to the English throne, in a country where the royal succession was dangerously murky. What made the situation more unstable was the perceived weakness of the reigning king, Henry VI, whose precarious health and reluctance to rule in the traditional fashion of medieval warrior kings forced the nobles surrounding him to exercise power in his name. The growing influence of the king's few favored ministers fostered competition and enmity amongst other prominent members of the English nobility. As a result of these conditions, almost from the very beginning, Edward's life and duty was given over to the advancement and indeed the survival of his family. Through his mother, Richard, Duke of York, was the legitimate great-grandson of Lionel of Antwerp, 1st Duke of Clarence, the second surviving son of the last undisputed King of England, Edward III. Through his father, Richard was also descended from Edward III's 4th surviving son, Edmund, 1st Duke of York. Edward III's eldest son, also named Edward and known as the Black Prince, had only a single male heir, Richard II, who subsequently had no children of his own. The Yorks later claimed that the closest male heir to the throne after the death of Richard II was actually the one-year-old infant Roger Mortimer, the grandson of Lionel and the grandfather of Richard, Duke of York. The Duke would come to emphasize this lineage heavily by 1460, when the crown was within his grasp. Up until then, Richard Plantagenet had been content to emphasize his lineage only from the 1st Duke of York. This was most likely due to two factors. First, Richard was descended from the Mortimers, not through his father, but through his mother, which weakened claims of inheritance in a society which favored sons. Additionally, Lionel, Duke of Clarence, had had no sons but only a daughter, Philippa, while John of Gaunt, the 3rd surviving son of Edward III, had borne a legitimate son, Henry Bolingbroke. Interestingly, while primogeniture remained overwhelmingly prevalent for centuries within English laws of inheritance, Edward IV was not the first King of England to stake a claim to the throne based upon the inheritance of a female ancestor, and neither would he be the last. Nonetheless, Richard, Duke of York, seemingly came to believe that his line had a claim to the English throne as good or better than did the reigning King Henry VI of the ruling House of Lancaster, whose grandfather, Henry Bolingbroke, had usurped the throne from his cousin Richard II. As we can see, a large part of the problem was that Edward III and his queen, Philippa of Hainault, had had so many children, most crucially 5 sons who survived to adulthood. Most medieval kings were lucky to have an heir and a spare. During the lifetime of Edward III and those of his many sons, there was little indication of the turmoil in which their increasingly numerous descendants would become embroiled, overlapping with the 100 Years' War with France. This period of roughly a century of major competition for the throne of England has been called the Wars of the Roses, after the badges worn by the opposing branches of the royal family. White Rose of York and the Red Rose of Lancaster. Tensions rose between the ruling House of Lancaster and the House of York during the late 1440s and 1450s. Edward's father, Richard, found himself frequently sidelined in favor of the Lancastrian dukes of Suffolk and Somerset, who not only held the king's ear, but also received positions and preferments. Not extended to the Duke of York. In 1446, the Duke of York's command post and roar was given instead to Edmund Beaufort, Duke of Somerset, which some historians see as the beginning of the bad blood between York and Lancaster. What made this situation more problematic was that by the 1450s, the crown was deeply in debt to the Duke of York, to the tune of almost £100,000. About 20% of this debt comprised loans the Duke had made to the crown, which remained unpaid, but the bulk of it represented unpaid wages for the dukes, several years of service in France. Meanwhile, the king's Lancastrian ministers regularly received repayment of loans made to the crown, including interest. The increasingly precarious state of England's economy by the early 1450s sparked rebellion in Kent and the southeast of England. Rebels, led by the Irishman Jack Cade, demanded the removal of the king's evil, greedy, and spendthrift advisors in favor of a broader representation of those men of good and noble birth. The Dukes of York, Exeter, Norfolk, and Buckingham were the names put forward most prominently by the rebels. Naturally, the Lancastrians suspected York of fomenting the rebellion to facilitate his own advancement, especially since Jack Cade took on the name of John Mortimer during the rebellion to associate himself with the Duke's perceived legitimacy as a prince of the blood. However, studies of the Kentish Rebellion indicate that local political and judicial corruption was viewed by the rebels as manifestations of similar corruption at King Henry's court and the tendency to demand the removal of evil counselors. In favor of others was fairly typical in past rebellions, until the birth of King Henry's son, Edward of Westminster. The Duke of York was technically the nearest claimant to the throne, and thus the most prominent man of good and noble birth in England, next to the king himself. This should not suggest, however, that the English people would support Henry's removal and the Duke's favor, which Richard Plantagenet would eventually discover to his own detriment. King Henry had been just a baby when he became king. Later, his lack of interest in government and his delegation of responsibility for his French territories to his Lancastrian favorites eventually resulted in the loss of all French lands won by his father Henry V, save for Calais. This contributed to massive resentment of the king's Lancastrian advisors and of the king himself. Many English people looked bitterly upon the many decades, the vast sums of money, and the countless lives which appeared to have been wasted conquering France, only to lose almost all they had gained to the ineptitude of the king and his closest ministers. When Henry VI began to suffer mental health crises during the 1450s, the Duke of York was twice declared Lord Protector during the king's incapacity. Parliament and many of York's contemporaries distrusted the notion of a regency controlled by King Henry's queen, Margaret of Anjou. Queens of England often perceived such weariness from the English people because they were frequently foreigners. Foreign members of court were always suspected of being spies, and queens who attempted to exercise power were invariably accused of wrongfully usurping kingly prerogatives. In reality, any move Queen Margaret made to help secure her husband's throne or her son's inheritance would be viewed with hostility by the great men of the realm. Margaret observed the growth of the Yorkist cause with alarm and a determination to defeat the man who seemed bent on taking her own son's place as heir to the throne. Noble families equally dissatisfied with the influence of Queen Margaret and the king's Lancastrian ministers at court joined the Yorkist cause, most particularly Duchess Cecily's clan, the powerful northern Neville family, represented by her brother Richard, Earl of Salisbury, and his highly charismatic son, also named Richard, Earl of Warwick, as the Yorkist faction, cultivated support primarily in London and the southeast of England and secured foreign strongholds in France and Ireland. As effective springboards for invasion, Queen Margaret strove to rally support in the Lancastrian strongholds in the Midlands, the First Battle of St. Albans. In May of 1455 was little more than a skirmish, but it set the English people on the path toward a series of internal conflicts, which would cause the crown to change hands no less than 6 times in the next 30 years. The beginnings of the Civil War in England, which developed over roughly a decade and a half, encompassed virtually all of Edward's childhood. He was most likely at Ludlow Castle in 1452, observing the Duke of Somerset presiding over the trials of those who had served Edward's father, who took part in an attempted coup, after which the Duke of York had fled to Ireland. At the age of 11, Edward accompanied his father to London in his role as Lord Protector to open Parliament, where Edward was formally recognized for the first time as the Earl of March and his father's heir. At the age of 12, he reportedly led a force of 10,000 men from Ludlow in a march on London to liberate his father from prison. The Yorkist advance was swiftly reported, and the Duke was released before their arrival. As the Lancastrian and Yorkist factions edged closer towards open warfare, Edward and his younger brother Edmund were increasingly involved in politics, a military mobilization, and were already expected to take on leadership roles. A letter written in June 1454 from the two boys to their father assured the Duke that Edward and Edmund were being dutiful in their studies and their military training. "We trust to God," the boys wrote, "that your gracious lordship and good fatherhood will be pleased." Following the First Battle of St. Albans in 1455, the recovered Henry VI, who desired peace above all else, sought to reconcile the great men of England and end the factional fighting. But the next 4 years were nonetheless fraught with open hostility at court and the recruitment of ever more armed retainers by both the Lancastrians and the Yorkists. In June 1459, there was a meeting of the Great Council at Coventry, to which no member of the York faction was invited. The Lancastrian attendees emerged with legal indictments for the Duke of York and his cohorts, who immediately organized themselves to march in force on the capital. It was their intention to attempt a peaceful settlement with the king, who desired the same, but the Queen's Lancastrian forces intercepted the Earl of Salisbury's forces at Ludford Bridge. Following this struggle, the Yorks were attainted for treason, which basically forced them into open rebellion after they wrote at Ludford. October 1459. Edward's family and supporters were separated as each fled the country. The Duke of York fled to Ireland with his son Edmund, Earl of Rutland, while Duchess Cecily and her younger children were taken into custody of King Henry. They were exempted from the attainder, however, and treated kindly and generously. Meanwhile, Edward took shelter with his uncle Salisbury and his cousin Warwick in Devon. Later, they covertly made their way to Calais. Warwick had been appointed captain of Calais during the Duke of York's second stint as protector. And thanks to Warwick's charisma and his skill at diplomacy and public relations, this last English stronghold in France was well reinforced with Yorkist supporters and sympathizers. Duke Richard likewise cultivated support for the Yorkist cause among the Irish earls, and within 6 months, the York faction were able to mount a successful invasion of England from both Ireland and France. Prior to the invasion, the Earl of Warwick spearheaded a widespread PR campaign to clarify the rebels' motives. He wrote dozens of letters and sent them to all regions of England. He also penned a manifesto, to which he, Edward, and their respective fathers, the Dukes of Salisbury and York, all signed their names. The manifesto assured the people of England that the York faction were interested only in banishing corruption and restoring order and good government to the realm. They swore their loyalty to King Henry and their commitment to serve him, but protested that his evil counselors had passed the sentence of attainder against the Yorks in order to profit from their loss and death. Edward and Warwick landed at Sandwich in late June of 1460. Accompanied by 2,000 men, they began their march to London, gathering supporters as they went. They knew that King Henry was marshalling his troops and reinforcing his position at Northampton, and that even now Queen Margaret's horses were advancing on London. Margaret's army, however, had earned a fearsome reputation among the merchant class as well as the common people. News of the pillaging and burning of towns along their route to London terrified the people of the capital, and the city decided to keep its gates fastened against the Lancastrian army. This course of action proved preferable when it became known the Earls of March and Warwick would arrive in London at any moment. Queen Margaret, betrayed by the English people, many of whom hated and feared her, and unwilling to force her way into the capital, retreated north once again. On the 2nd of July, Edward and Warwick were warmly welcomed into the city by London's mayor, the Archbishop of Canterbury, and other assembled dignitaries and spectators, while the weary and outraged Lancastrian garrison withdrew into the Tower. It seems highly unlikely that deposing King Henry and taking the throne for themselves was the goal for any of the Yorks at this point. It certainly does not seem to have been so for Edward and Warwick. They explained again that they desired above all else only to meet with and assert their loyalty to the king, whom they were certain would lift their sentences of attainder and restore their titles, fortunes, and inheritances, which had been revoked by the charges of treason. They promised then to help restore good government of the realm under King Henry. If, however, the king's counselors persisted in setting him against the House of York, his loyal subjects, they would have no choice but to fight. A corporate loan of £1,000 was extended to Edward and Warwick from the merchants of London to pay the soldiers who would fight in the coming battle. This relatively modest sum is somewhat telling. It suggests that the people of the capital trusted Edward more than Queen Margaret, but probably not by much. Further, it illustrates that the people of London believed Edward and Warwick when they insisted that they had no plans to depose the king. For why would they fund such a venture? And if they were willing and desirous to have Henry deposed, why would they not have given the Yorks a more generous loan? 2 days after his arrival, Edward led his army out of London, arriving at Northampton on the 9th of July. Warwick was sent to negotiate with the Duke of Buckingham, who was quite unwilling to allow Warwick to see the king. There seemed to be no other course but to fight Edward. Warwick and Warwick's uncle William Neville, Lord Fauconberg, each led one of 3 troop columns. The Yorks seemed to be facing an uphill battle at Northampton. They were outnumbered at least 2 to 1. The king's forces occupied a reinforced position and had the use of several large cannon. The Battle of Northampton was in fact the first military engagement in English history in which field artillery was actually present on the battlefield. Unfortunately for the Lancastrians, the 10th of July, 1460 was an excessively rainy day, rendering their cannon useless. Further, the vanguard, commanded by Lord Edmund Grey, defected to the Yorkist side early in the battle, shifting the momentum quickly in the favor of York. With these rather fortunate advantages, the struggle lasted little more than half an hour. The number of casualties were not reported on the York side, which might suggest that they were minimal. 300 men fell on the Lancaster side, including the Duke of Buckingham and all of the other high-ranking royalist captains. Edward and Warwick found King Henry in his tent, having been captured and detained by a Yorkist archer. They greeted him respectfully and informed him that they had come to escort him back to London. Though he was still the king, was now effectively Edward and Warwick's prisoner. The Yorks entered London once again on the 16th of July in triumph. After the Lancastrian garrison at the Tower surrendered, the Yorks issued writs summoning Parliament for the 7th of October, where they planned to reverse the attainders of treason cast upon them by the Coventry meeting of June 1450. 9. This was indeed the first act of the Parliament, which met in October of 1460. Edward, Warwick, and all the rest of the Yorkist supporters seemed content with this state of affairs, and it seems doubtful that any of them would have considered that deposing the king would be a good idea. King Henry was their greatest political asset, and as long as they could keep the most powerful and troublesome Lancastrians from court and sufficiently intimidated, their influence and prosperity was assured. Richard, Duke of York, however, seemed recently to have developed much loftier ambitions than simply regaining his former titles and properties, or contenting himself with the position of second most powerful man in England. Documentary sources confirm that as early as the 8th of September 1460, only 3 weeks after the writ summoning Parliament had been issued, the Duke of York had dropped King Henry's regnal year from all of his correspondence, dating all of his communications, instead using "this year of grace." It was highly unusual. When he arrived in London for the Parliament in October, he rode like a king at the head of his retainers, his sword unsheathed and held upright before him in unmistakably royal fashion, his banners proudly displaying the royal arms of England when he strode confidently into Parliament, laid his hands upon the throne, and declared himself king by virtue of his descent from Lionel, Duke of Clarence, elder brother of King Henry VI's great-grandfather John of Gaunt. He was greeted with stunned and uneasy silence. Duke Richard's claims were apparently a step too far. What is noteworthy about the reaction to these proceedings is that the Parliament and its attendees were overwhelmingly pro-Yorkist. Yet they clearly still had no desire to revisit the instability of a usurpation, nor were they willing to repudiate solemn oaths of loyalty, which they had all sworn to. King Henry Edward was almost certainly present at this historic parliament, and one can only imagine what he thought of his father's actions in that moment. But if the reactions of York's Neville relations are any indication, it is possible that he was as embarrassed and taken aback as they. For whether or not they knew of the Duke's intentions, neither Salisbury nor Waddick spoke a word or made any gesture in support of the Duke's claim. The Commons declined to deliberate on such academic matters of succession, leaving it to the Lords to decide most of the power. Rokers present distrusted and disliked Margaret of Anjou, and had clearly bought into the convenient rumors that her son Edward of Westminster was not King Henry's son, and was therefore illegitimate. With the Act of Accord, Parliament ultimately recognized the Duke as the legitimate heir to the throne upon Henry's death, but would not consent to the deposition of the King's Parliament. And the Yorks had reckoned without Queen Margaret, however, whose suspicions that the Duke of York sought to dethrone her husband and disinherit her son had now been totally confirmed. She began to marshal her forces in the north of England, and loyal Lancastrians flocked to join her army at Hull. Most problematic for the Yorkist cause was that their main holdings and properties were in the north, and many of them were now being raided and despoiled by the Lancastrians. In early December, the Duke of York departed for the north at the head of his army, together with his son Edmund and his brother-in-law Salisbury. Meanwhile, Edward was sent to Wales to recruit troops, and Warwick stayed behind to hold London. Then, at the news of his father's death at the Battle of Wakefield, Edward prepared to depart for London, but changed his plans to meet the advancing forces of Jasper Tudor at Mortimer's Cross. Following Edward's victory, he learned of the unfortunate losses suffered by Warwick and his men at the Second Battle of St. Albans. Warwick had been wounded, and King Henry had been recaptured by the Lancastrians, but the city of London had shown her Yorkist colors once again and shut their gates to Margaret of Anjou now that his father was dead. The 18-year-old Edward was the heir to the House of York. They had secured the capital and still had the support of many in Parliament, but they had lost King Henry, who had been the pivot around which Yorkist authority had coalesced. It may be convincingly argued that Edward believed that the only option now was to assume the throne himself. He had not been the one to set his family upon this path, but they must seemingly stay on it or be destroyed. Edward almost certainly understood, as did the rest of his family and his supporters, that if they yielded the throne back to King Henry, none of them would be likely to survive the wrath of Margaret of Bonjour or other loyal Lancastrians. He had not intended to assume the throne, but the fact that he acted quickly and decisively when he believed it necessary testifies to his confidence, given the popular disaffection with the regime of King Henry VI, as well as popular dislike of his queen. Perhaps Edward believed that he could only do better. The fact that Edward was essentially thrust upon the throne by the actions of his father and the vagaries of circumstance should not suggest, however, that he found becoming king unwelcome, or that he in any way hesitated to exercise the powers and prerogatives of a king when the opportunity arose. Edward's entry into London on the 26th of February 1461 and the events of the next 9 days were carefully choreographed. Both he and Warwick were warmly received by the people. One chronicler reported a verse being sung in Edward's praise among Londoners in the days following his arrival. "Let us walk in a new vineyard. Let us make a gay garden in the month of March with this fair white rose and herb, the Earl of March." Edward's lineage and its superiority to the lineage of the Lancastrian usurpers was emphasized in public speeches on the 3rd of March. The new Great Council, thrown together rather quickly, met and agreed to accept Edward as king. On the morning of the 4th of March, he attended Mass at St. Paul's before processing to the Great Hall at Westminster. There, the Archbishop of Canterbury administered Edward the oath. He was draped in royal robes, crowned with the cap of a state, and took his seat upon the king's bench, scepter in hand. After this rather rapid coronation, the more formal incarnation of which would come a few months later, Edward IV was proclaimed king throughout the capital just 2 days later. Dozens of proclamations, writs, and letters were sent out to help consolidate the new Yorkist regime. The English people were invited to pledge their loyalty to the new king. All who had served in the Lancastrian cause against the Yorkists were promised a full pardon and the retention of their property. On condition they submit to the new monarchy, except for a short list of roughly 24 high-ranking Lancastrians and anyone with an income of more than 100 marks per year, which was virtually all of the nobility and gentry. Using this strategy, Edward placed far more pressure, the English elite, to support his right to rule. Further, it was decreed that anyone who killed or captured and handed over a high-ranking Lancastrian enemy to King Edward would receive a reward of £100. These measures were effective to a point, but there was still far more to do. To bring England under Edward's control, the Yorkists held London and the southeast and were steadily cultivating greater support in the south. But Wales, in the north of England, remained a patchwork of Lancastrian, Yorkist, and regional loyalties, which would take more time and effort to subdue and stabilize. Additionally, the general instability wrought by civil war in England had emboldened the Scots to begin raids and hostile incursions over the northern border. Edward had less than 3 weeks in London to plan his next move before he went out on campaign again on the 13th of March. He departed London leading an army headed for Yorkshire. The Battle of Towton, fought on the 29th of March 1461, was the bloodiest of the entire Civil War, with likely the highest casualties of any battle ever fought on English soil. Estimates of those killed at Towton ranged from as few as 9,000 to 28,000. Roughly 75% of the English peerage had at least one family member present at the battle, and based on the number of retainers each was capable of putting into the field, a maximum estimate of 50,000 men engaged at the peak. The battle is not far-fetched. Edward's forces were significantly outnumbered, but his typical approach of bold, courageous, offensive, and conscientious use of every advantage eventually routed the main Lancastrian forces. The armies of Lancaster occupied the higher ground, but the Yorkist archers took advantage of the harsh, bitter winds and snow blowing into their enemies' faces, unleashing a barrage of arrows into the Lancastrian ranks. Meanwhile, the high winds and reduced visibility rendered the Lancastrian archers nearly useless. Incensed, they charged down the hill, towards the enemy, and Edward's army rushed out to meet them. The battle raged all day, but despite their superior numbers, the Lancastrians were eventually defeated and the survivors were routed. By nightfall, Towton constituted a major consolidation of Edward's power. It precipitated the flight to Scotland of Henry VI, Margaret Value, and their son Edward of Westminster. It had cut a swath through the English nobility and crippled their ability to resist the New Yorkist regime. It had loosened the Lancastrian grip on the north of England by removing the royalist northern earls, leaving the region open to greater control by the Yorkists. Some Lancastrian loyalists had escaped, but many had fled the country with the royal family. Finally, Towton had allowed Edward to cover himself in glory and legitimate his claim to the throne, not just by right of birth, but by right of conquest as well. Edward's reign lasted roughly 2 decades and is unique in English history. He is the only king of England to have ever won the throne, to have lost it, and to have later won the throne a second time. Consequently, his reign is typically organized historically into 2 periods, his first reign and his second reign. Edward's rule was strengthened after his victory at Towton, but Lancastrian resistance remained a pressing issue for the next 3 years. The regions of Northumberland and Wales proved to be particularly staunch supporters of Lancaster and difficult to subdue. Edward largely delegated the quelling of these ongoing regional rebellions to his lieutenants, particularly during his first year as king, when he was busy taking the reins of government and management of the kingdom's legal and financial infrastructure in hand. Edward presided over his first parliament in November of 1461, at which his legitimate right to the crown was proclaimed. The Lancastrian line was characterized as one of usurpation, and the increasing degeneracy of the realm was noted as far as conditions surrounding England's economic and local judicial affairs were concerned. Edward was not exaggerating. Under Henry VI's government, royal revenues had fallen to less than 1/4 of what they had been at the end of the previous century. The constant wars with France and the instability of English politics had taken their toll on the 15th century economy in England. Worse still, justice was just as uneven, inefficient, and as tainted by corruption as it had been during the Kentish Rebellion a decade before. Edward vowed to take this disastrous situation firmly in hand. To a significant extent, Edward did endeavor to keep these promises. His repeated attendance in the court of the King's Bench was remarkable enough behavior for the king to be discussed amongst contemporary London commentators. He exhorted the great men whom he generously gifted with duchies and earldoms to oversee the equitable and ethical dispensation of justice. But in reality, local control was almost complete, and the king's control of individual regions was tenuous, held together only by the strength of Edward's personality and the loyalty he strove to cultivate through generosity and magnanimity. Edward was also the first king to introduce the methods of privatization, with the management of royal lands and finances, although the Tudors, beginning with Henry VII, tend to get most of the credit for this kind of innovation. The fact that Edward IV was never raised or groomed to be king explains much about his approach to royal revenues, which he handled as if they were the privately owned estate, rather than continue the medieval practice of collecting fixed rents from tenant farmers, who were typically allowed to keep any profits. Edward instead hired stewards and receivers to whom he paid wages in order to collect all profits. Further, royal revenues are now paid to the king's personal household account rather than the royal exchequer. Edward was also the first king to invest his own money in various business and finance ventures in much the same manner as any merchant. In this manner, he reduced the likelihood that he would have to rely on parliamentary taxation for funding, and by the middle of his second reign, he had managed to chip away at most of England's debts. Unfortunately, he had also piled up some of his own. Edward understood that he was expected to fit the image of the splendid medieval warrior king. He had displayed impressive bravery and skill on the battlefield, and now he was determined to outshine Henry VI in every other way as well. Edward, therefore, spent consistently and lavishly on fine clothes, rich jewels, exquisite tapestries, plates, and fine furnishings for his palaces. He succeeded in tutting an immensely impressive figure, especially compared to the notably frail, confused, and shabby King Henry when his power was at its final ebb. For Edward, it was crucial that both his subjects and foreign dignitaries should see him as the ideal king. He understood that the image of prosperity would make loans far more accessible to the crown, and that the valuable assets he was accumulating could serve two purposes: as financial collateral and as a means to impress visitors. The expense that it took to secure such magnificence meant that by the time of his death, Edward left the treasury only marginally better off than he found it. Edward was barely 19 years old when he assumed the throne, and as a young man he was sometimes more apt to pursue his pleasures than immerse himself in the day-to-day nitty-gritty of governing. Edward was fond of riding, hunting, jousting, and feasting and drinking with his friends. Luckily, his love of the table did not affect him adversely as a young man, since he was highly active and athletic. Edward also kept quite a few mistresses during his reign, although only a few are known by name. Lady Elizabeth Lucy was Edward's mistress for many years, both before and after his marriage, and he had two illegitimate children by her whom he acknowledged, Arthur and Elizabeth. Other well-known mistresses of Edward's include the married Lady Buckler, Eleanor Talbot, and Elizabeth Shaw, known more popularly as Jane. In the first few years of Edward's first reign, when he seemed to want to play rather than work, he had the habit of delegating many political duties to the highest-ranking and most trusted great men in the Yorkist faction, principally Richard Neville, Earl of Warwick. Warwick was highly intelligent, capable, and have been crucial to both the military and propaganda campaigns in the Yorkist cause. Edward had been exceedingly generous to all of his family and supporters, and this was no less true of Warwick. He had rewarded this most important of his lieutenants with the stewardship of the Duchy of Lancaster, the post of Lord High Admiral of England, and many other offices and preferments. For the first few years of Edward's reign, the king was largely approachable only through Warwick. This contributed to the conviction of many contemporary observers, and almost certainly Warwick himself, that he, rather than Edward, was the real ruler of England. His active involvement and the success of the Yorkist cause, and his execution of Edward's policies and administration during the early years, had earned him the label the Kingmaker. No doubt, Warwick had been pivotal to Edward's accession to the throne and to the consolidation of Yorkist power during Edward's first reign. But perhaps these facts caused Warwick, as well as some of Edward's biographers and historians, to forget the reality that Edward was not his puppet, but very much his own man, with a mind and a will of his own. Chief among Warwick's early grievances with Edward involved the king's marriage. Warwick had in mind a prestigious royal marriage to a French princess for Edward, and he also favored a pro-French trade policy, which he worked assiduously to cultivate when Edward declined to follow Warwick's advice. In these matters, it drove a wedge between them, which steadily worsened during the later 1460s. The first blow came in the summer of 1464, when, to forestall any arrangement of a royal marriage, Edward abruptly announced that he had wed Elizabeth Woodville, the widowed Lady Grey, in secret at her family's home some weeks previously. Not only did this inconvenience and embarrass Warwick, who had been negotiating for a French princess on the king's behalf, but it showed that the still youthful 22-year-old Edward was far less pliable than Warwick had believed. The king's marriage was controversial to most of his court. Elizabeth was not only a widow with two young sons, but her late husband had died fighting for the Lancastrians. Her father, Sir Richard Rivers, was not a nobleman, but a common knight who had wed the noble widow of the Duke of Bedford, Jacquetta of Luxembourg. Elizabeth was, critics said distastefully, no fit consort for a king. More troubling to Warwick and other high-ranking Yorkists was the large family that the new queen brought with her. Her numerous siblings, and later her many children, were soon betrothed in the most prestigious matches that the English nobility would offer, stimulating much jealousy, resentment, and concern that there would be far fewer advantageous marriages to be arranged for the children of the Yorkist peerage. Elizabeth and Edward, however, showed every sign of their happiness and obvious love for one another despite the Ferrari. But they had wrought in the court and across the country with their unconventional and socially unequal marriage. Reportedly, Edward was immediately smitten with Elizabeth. In portraits and illustrations, she seemed to have had golden or reddish blonde hair, and one chronicler described her as the most beautiful woman in the island of Britain. With lovely, heavy-lidded eyes, the most famous portrait of Elizabeth Woodville, displayed at Queen's College at Cambridge, shows a face with very fine features and what appear to be warm, light brown eyes. The painting is believed to be a copy of one painted from life in 1471, but again, the details of her appearance, like those in Edward's portraiture, might not be quite accurate. Edward, a notorious libertine with women at the best of times, was said to have propositioned Elizabeth very soon after their first meeting, when she had petitioned him for the return of her husband's property following his death. The story goes that Elizabeth had initially refused to submit to Edward's desires, defending her honor quite literally with a knife. Obsessed and unable to forget her, the young king then offered her marriage. What is remarkable about this particular royal marriage is the ease with which Edward could have bedded and discarded Elizabeth. He could easily have denied or repudiated a marriage conducted in secret had he wanted to, especially one so disadvantageous and guaranteed to be opposed by almost everyone. The most reasonable explanation for the fact that he did not was that he loved Elizabeth and had no wish to marry anyone else. Their marriage was a prolific one, producing 10 children over 14 years, 8 of whom survived infancy and 5 of whom survived their adolescence. Nonetheless, Edward continued to take mistresses with regularity even after his marriage to Elizabeth Woodville, which no doubt strained their relationship, but which did not appear to unduly upset the close and happy family life which both Edward and Elizabeth worked to cultivate. Edward's marriage had alienated and inconvenienced Warwick, but he was perhaps made angrier by the king's decision in 1467 to pursue a Burgundian trade policy rather than a French one. To Warwick's dismay, Edward cemented his new alliance with Duke Charles of Burgundy by giving him his sister Margaret in marriage. Warwick grew sullen and resentful in the ensuing years and began to look to Edward's younger brother, George, Duke of Clarence, as a more promising replacement for the king he could not control. In 1469, Warwick and Clarence began circulating a rumor on the continent that Edward was illegitimate in order to plant the seeds of doubt, which might clear George's path to the throne. Against Edward's strict refusals, Warwick and Clarence slipped away to Calais, where Warwick wed his daughter Isabel to George. Subsequently, rebellions broke out in the north of England, which some historians consider to have been fomented by Warwick and Clarence, but which could just as easily have been the result of ongoing economic difficulties and local corruption which the conspirators exploited for their own purposes when they attempted to deal with the northern rebels. Edward's forces were intercepted by Warwick's at Edgecote Moor, where they suffered a terrible defeat. Edward subsequently fell into Warwick's hands, and in the ensuing months, Warwick attempted to force his abdication, or, failing that, exercise power in Edward's name. He did not have sufficient support to buttress either his own or Clarence's authority, however, and was soon forced to release his outraged king and cousin Edward. Edward was reportedly deeply shocked and hurt by the betrayal of his brother and his cousin, two people he loved and had trusted implicitly. The years 1469 to 1470 must have been a time of enormous stress and dejection for Edward, who had to confront the mistakes he had made as king, the duplicity of his family, and the grief and rage of his wife, whose father and brother Warwick had executed. After the battle at Edgecote, Edward demonstrated his constructive spirit and magnanimity by forgiving Warwick and Clarence, organizing a public reconciliation in Parliament and restoring them to favor. But by 1470, it was clear that Warwick and Clarence had not abandoned their schemes to unsettle Edward's reign. When both were implicated in facilitating a rebellion in Lincolnshire to avoid Edward's wrath, the two fled once again to Calais, which shut its doors to Warwick. At this point, Warwick and Clarence were short on both options and supporters, and they had little choice but to throw in their lot with the exiled Lancastrians. The King of France helped organize a reconciliation between Warwick and Margaret of Anjou. Together, they planned an invasion of England and arranged the marriage between Warwick's daughter, Anne Neville, and Margaret's son, Edward of Westminster. Unfortunately, Edward was in Yorkshire dealing with another rebellion when Warwick invaded the capital. Queen Elizabeth and her three young daughters, Elizabeth, Mary, and Cecily, fled into sanctuary at Westminster. Bobby and Henry VI was released from the Tower, where he had been imprisoned since his capture in 1465, and was reinstated as king. The second reign of Henry VI was short and turbulent. The terribly fractious mix of Lancastrians and Yorkists made the imperial center weak and inefficient. Within less than a year in exile in Holland and Flanders respectively, Edward had gathered sufficient strength to retake England once more. Edward arrived in London in early April of 1471, where he reconciled with his brother. George had been alienated by the plan to reinstate Henry VI, most likely because he saw no profit in it for him. His mother and sisters had assured him in secret communications that if he threw himself on Edward's mercy, he would be welcomed back into the family fold. Edward then marched his men out of London to face Warwick and Margaret of Anjou on the morning of Easter Sunday. Under a near impenetrable fog, which he used to his full advantage, Edward's forces defeated Warlocks at the Battle of Barnet. Warwick was killed on the battlefield, and mere days later, Edward's armies confronted those of Margaret. Bonjour at Tewkesbury, where, despite their superior numbers, Edward once again prevailed. Margaret's son, Edward of Westminster, was killed in battle, while the Lancastrian queen herself was taken prisoner. Edward re-entered London in triumph on the 21st of May, 1471. He went immediately to Westminster to be reunited with his wife and children. There he discovered that during her time in sanctuary, Queen Elizabeth had given birth to their first son, Prince Edward. The king's happiness was described in a contemporary poem. The king comforted the queen, his sweet baby full tenderly he did kiss. The young prince he beheld, and in his arms did bear. Thus his bale turned him to bliss. After sorrow, joy, the course of the world is. The sight of his baby released part of his woe. Thus the will of God in everything done. Edward had survived his deposition, fought the final battles of his military career, regained the throne, and thankfully his family had been kept safe. But the ugliness necessary to preserve his power was not yet. That very night, King Henry VI was murdered in the Tower. Most historians agree that it was most likely done on Edward's orders by means of a hard and swift blow to the back of the head. While Henry's son, Edward of Westminster, was still alive, there was no point to killing Henry, an action which would remove an imprisoned heir and create a new one who was already walking free. Now that his son was dead, Henry could be safely removed. Some historians believe that this dark deed was carried out by Edward's younger brother, Richard, Duke of Gloucester. Intelligent, ambitious, and reputedly ruthless Richard had remained steadfastly loyal to Edward, which makes his later alleged crimes against his nephews, remembered as the princes in the Tower, all the more heinous and puzzling. Now Edward IV was king indeed. His second reign, which lasted for the remaining 12 years of his life, was somewhat more placid than the first, and greater domestic peace allowed him to focus more intently on the reforms he had not fully achieved. During his first decade on the throne, Edward continued his work to improve the rule of law, making a point of accompanying officials to oversee the reform and administration of justice, particularly in regions where unrest and rebellion had penetrated. While perhaps no medieval king could have succeeded in entirely banishing the phenomenon of local corruption, England under Edward IV had at least attained a greater stability and institutional efficiency than had ever been the case under Henry VI. Edward also continued to work to make the crown financially solvent once again. In addition to his innovative strategy of privatization of royal lands and finances to increase profits, sometimes Edward's methods of revenue raising were less than honest. The confiscation of Lancastrian loans and assets were par for the course with any regime change, and these brought in a great deal of revenue, but the king frequently had to award them to his brothers and supporters to keep them happy. Edward frequently made use of benevolences, which were payments to the king to avoid military service. Further, Edward made sure that when the English coinage was revalued during his reign, he raised the minting fees on gold and silver coins, which brought him a handsome profit. The king was also not above petitioning Parliament for funds in order to go to war, but then promptly making peace with his supposed enemies and appropriating the parliamentary grant to swell the royal coffers. This is precisely what he did in 1475, when he undertook an invasion of France. It does not appear, however, that this was his intention from the beginning. Edward was a military man and a great general, and no doubt he was attracted to the idea of victory and martial glory in France, which would ensure his fame and immortality alongside Henry V and Edward III. He spent years cultivating military alliances with Burgundy and Brittany against the French king, and made great efforts to foster peaceful relations with the Scots so that they would not invade England in France's favor. Yet by the time Edward finally made it to France, accompanied by all his nobility and their retainers, his allies had deserted him. His subsequent decision to sue for peace was a pragmatic and intelligent decision, which secured the best possible outcome Edward could have wanted, given the circumstances. No money was wasted in any protracted campaign, and the king, Louis XI, had been so anxious for the English to leave that he agreed to a generous tribute of £15,000 and an additional £10,000 per annum, and a marriage between the Dauphin and Edward's eldest daughter, Elizabeth, who would receive a joint dowry of £60,000, an absurd and unprecedented sum for a royal marriage. Edward's captains and the English people, however, saw it very differently. Many were alienated by Edward's decision not to fight the French and viewed his peace strategy as a sign of cowardice and a cause for shame. The nobility was soon pacified by the economic advantages of the peace from which they benefited, but Edward's broader popularity suffered a significant dip after 1475, and he began to gain a reputation for avarice and greed. Still, the results of the French campaign ensured that Edward never again had to petition Parliament for funds, and it ensured that when the king died, he would not leave his heir with a mountain of debts. However, thanks to his own profligate spending, the royal treasury only had about £1,200 in cash upon Edward's death. Worse still, Edward's relationship with his brother George deteriorated significantly in the ensuing years. Edward refused to allow his brother to marry the heiress of Burgundy, as he was still fearful that, given the power and the opportunity, his brother might still challenge him for the throne. Resentful, George sought to revive not only the old rumors that Edward was the illegitimate son of a common archer, but that he had been previously wed in secret prior to his marriage, and therefore all of his children were illegitimate as well. He was also said to have paid a seer to foretell the king's death. Far from being forgiving this time, Edward presided over George's trial for treason himself, and the Duke of Clarence was executed in the Tower on the 18th of February, 1478. Some discussion of Edward's legitimacy is merited here, for it has been a significant source of contention among historians in the last 2 decades. In 2002, historian Michael K. Jones uncovered evidence which he believed provided conclusive proof that Edward IV was in fact illegitimate. The parish records of Rouen Cathedral indicate that roughly 9 months before Edward's birth, in April 1442, during a crucial 5-week when Edward was likely to have been conceived, Richard, the Duke of York, was on campaign in Pontoise. However, this evidence also rests on several assumptions, none of which can be verified for certain. First, Jones assumes that Duchess Cecily remained in Broyle for the entirety of the period, or that Duke Richard did not return at any point during the Pontoise campaign, neither of which can be confirmed. Further, we know that Duchess Cecily had just lost her second child, a son named Henry, who lived only a few days. Cecily and Richard had departed England for Rouen shortly after the child's death. The Duke and Duchess had grown up together, in the same household, and while their marriage had been arranged since they were children, their relationship was as close to a love match as an arranged marriage in the medieval period could possibly have been. The notion that Cecily would have had an affair, betraying the husband she ostensibly loved, while still grieving for her dead son, strains credulity somewhat. Even more unlikely is the possibility that the Duchess, who would have been constantly surrounded by servants in her daily life, could have done something so scandalous as to have an affair with a common archer without anyone ever finding out. While the Rouen Cathedral Register is a compelling piece of historical evidence, it is far from conclusive, and most historians still continue to accept Edward IV was of legitimate birth after all. The rumors of Edward's illegitimacy first appeared in 1469, when Warwick was attempting to place George on the throne in Edward's place. In the spring of 1483, Edward became seriously ill. Observers and chroniclers differ on the cause of his illness. One stated that he had caught a chill while fishing on the River Thames, which later developed into a fever. Others claimed he had been poisoned. Yet another claimed that the king had suffered a fit of apoplexy or a stroke. Considering Edward's lifestyle and weight gain in later years, this is probably the most likely scenario. The king lived for only 10 more days after the onset of his mysterious illness, but it was long enough to revise his will and arrange for governance and stability during his son's minority. His brother Richard, Duke of Gloucester, was to be appointed Lord Protector until the 12-year-old Prince Edward came of age, while he was only 40 years old. Edward was lucky enough to die in his bed, with his family and his dearest friends at his bedside. Assured and comforted that his son would succeed him, these were luxuries afforded few medieval warrior kings. Some historians assert that Edward's legacy is not as celebrated as it deserves to be. He was undoubtedly one of the greatest generals ever to sit upon the English throne. Having never lost a battle at which he had been present, yet his name is almost never mentioned alongside England's greatest warrior kings, such as Henry V or Edward III. The most likely reason for this is that all of Edward's victories were against his own countrymen rather than against foreigners, and many historians have likely found it difficult to celebrate the abilities of a man whose military genius resulted in the shedding of so much English blood and the destruction of the flower of English chivalry in the mid to late 15th century. Moreover, Edward's legal and financial reforms laid the groundwork for the later Tudor regime, which allowed for greater ease of centralization, facilitating England's journey to eventually becoming Great Britain. Edward was well liked by the English people for much of his reign, which is apparent in the public outpouring of grief and national mourning which follow his death. He was in many ways a far more approachable king than the English people had ever had. He was warm, friendly, likable, forgiving, brave, and confident. He was also probably the most English king that the realm had had since the Norman conquest, a quality that the English people, who distrusted most foreigners, undoubtedly appreciated. Edward's parents, grandparents, and great-grandparents were all born and bred English. Moreover, Edward married an Englishwoman himself rather than a foreign princess, which was almost never the case for English monarchs. Some historians consider Edward IV to have failed as a king because of the chaos, violence, and upheaval which followed his death, with the imprisonment of his sons, the usurpation by his brother Richard, and his subsequent war with Henry Tudor for the throne. However, this perspective fails to take into account that had Edward lived, his children would have dominated the royal marriage market of Europe by marrying into the royal families of France, Spain, Scotland, and Denmark, and quite possibly other royal houses as well. Moreover, had Edward IV lived longer, his son would have succeeded to the throne, and the Tudor dynasty might never have appeared. Yet, thanks to the clever and skillful negotiations of Elizabeth Woodville with Henry Tudor's mother, Margaret Beaufort, the eldest child of Edward IV did in fact succeed to the throne when Elizabeth of York married Henry Tudor and was crowned Queen of England. She became the progenitor of her father's legacy, a long line of kings and queens of England. What do you think of Edward IV? Please let us know in the comments below, and in the meantime, thank you very much for watching.